The wind howled through the skeletal trees like a choir of lost voices, each gust carrying with it a heavy whisper. The town of Ashmore had been abandoned for decades, its streets swallowed by nature, its buildings sagging under the weight of years and secrets. People avoided it. There was something about Ashmore that gnawed at the mind, a feeling that unseen eyes were always watching. It had all started with the fire. No one knew exactly how it began or why. But on the night of October 31st, 1953, the church bell of St. Rennes rang 13 times. Minutes later, a fire erupted from nowhere, spreading like a living creature. The flames roared, crimson and voracious, devouring the town. By dawn, Ashmore was reduced to smoldering ashes and silent ruins. But it wasn't the fire that kept people away, it was the bodies. When the fire finally died, the townsfolk who came to help found something unspeakable, figures frozen in the ash. Men, women, children, all their faces twisted into horrified screams, as if the fire had burned not just their bodies, but their very souls. Worst of all, their eyes, though glassy and melted, seemed to be looking at whoever approached. No one could bury the dead. The corpses crumbled to dust at a single touch. Over time, stories spread like rot. They said Ashmore was cursed, a place where souls didn't move on. People spoke of shadows darting between burnt-out buildings, of whispers on the wind that called your name. But no one dared go there. Until tonight, at the edge of the town, under a broken moon, 5 strangers gathered, their breath steaming in the frigid air. None of them knew each other before tonight, yet they all felt an irresistible pull toward Ashmore, like an invisible string wound around their hearts, yanking them closer with every step. Ethan, the skeptic, led the group, tall and wiry. His face was hard-edged, always searching for something tangible to prove the story's false. "It's just an old ghost town," he said, his voice sharp and dismissive. "There's no such thing as curses." Beside him walked Mara, a historian with dark, hollow eyes and a notebook clutched tightly in her gloved hands. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice had the eerie calm of someone who'd seen things they could never unsee. Then there was Benny, the youngest, barely out of his teens. He fidgeted constantly, a video camera strapped to his chest. "Gotta capture everything," he muttered. "For proof." The light of the camera blinked in the dark like an unholy eye. Sarah, pale and gaunt, trailed behind them. She carried a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. No one asked what it was, and she never offered to explain. And finally, there was Victor, a man with scars across his hands and a hollow laugh. He claimed he'd been to Ashmore before. "Don't touch anything," he warned the others. "Not the dirt, not the walls, and definitely not the ash." They crossed the crumbling gate and entered the dead town. The streets were worse than they had imagined. Charred remains of buildings loomed like blackened teeth, and the ground felt soft, as though something was shifting beneath their feet. Benny shined his flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the fog that pooled thick in the streets. "Look at this place," Mara murmured. "It's like time stopped." The beam of Benny's flashlight suddenly froze on something ahead, a statue, standing in the middle of the street. "No, not a statue," Sarah whispered, her voice brittle. "It was a man, or what was left of him." His body was petrified in mid-sprint, one hand outstretched, his mouth contorted into a soundless scream. The ash coating his form was cracked and peeling. Beneath it, something dark and slick pulsed like skin. Benny stumbled back, his camera shaking. It's moving." They watched in horror as the ash shifted. The figure's head turned an inch, just enough for the melted eyes to lock onto them. Victor swore under his breath. "It's starting." "What's starting?" Ethan demanded. Victor pointed at the fog rolling through the street. It wasn't fog at all. It was smoke. Thick, dark smoke, creeping across the ground and curling up toward them like 1,000 fingers. "The fire," Victor said, his voice shaking for the first time. "It's coming back. And so are they." Mara flipped open her notebook, and in the dim light, Benny caught a glimpse of what was scrawled on the first page. "They burn forever. But they don't burn alone." Suddenly, from somewhere deep within the ruins, the bell of St. Rennes began to toll. 1, 2, 3. The sound reverberated through the town, low and heavy, rattling in their chests like a heartbeat. 4, 5, 6. Victor grabbed Sarah's arm. Run! But it was too late. From the ruins of the buildings, the shadows began to pour out, crawling on hands and knees, their faces lit by invisible flames, their mouths open as if screaming. Sarah's bundle fell from her arms, unrolling on the ground. Inside was a child-sized skeleton, its skull still blackened by fire. "You shouldn't have brought it here," Victor shouted, his voice cracking. The bell continued to toll, louder and louder, as the smoke wrapped around them. 7, 8, 9. The figures emerged fully now. Men, women, children, all of them encased in ash, their bodies jerking and twitching unnaturally as they moved closer. Benny screamed as one of them lunged, its hand slamming into his chest. He gasped, his skin turning pale as the shadow pulled at him, as though sucking something out. Victor shoved Ethan. "We have to get to the church. It's the only safe place." Mara's voice trembled. "The church started this." The tolling continued. 10, 11, 12. The figures closed in, their eyes blazing like embers in the dark. And then, as the final toll rang through Ashmore, 13, the fire came alive again, and the screaming began. The fire didn't roar. It breathed. It spread with deliberate intent, a rolling wave of crimson and gold that licked the buildings and the ground, yet didn't consume them. The flames curled toward the group as if it were alive and hungry. Smoke burned their lungs as they staggered backward, trying to find a way out. But the fire didn't follow the laws of nature. It wasn't fire at all, just the shape of it. Victor's scarred hand shot out, grabbing Ethan by the collar. "Move! Now!" Benny's screams had gone silent. His body lay crumpled where he'd fallen, steam rising from his open mouth. His camera was still rolling, the blinking light pulsing rhythmically, reflecting something moving inside the lens. Ethan pulled his gaze away, bile rising in his throat. "What is this place? What's happening to us?" Mara, still clutching her notebook, coughed violently, her voice ragged. "The fire? It takes more than flesh. It takes everything." The ground beneath them trembled. From the distance, St. Ren's Church loomed like a jagged silhouette against the blaze, its steeple blackened and broken. But now there was light spilling from its cracked windows, light that throbbed like a heartbeat. "The church," Victor repeated, his voice rasping with panic. "It's the only place to hold them back." Sarah stood frozen, her hollow eyes fixed on Benny's lifeless form. The child-sized skeleton lay just beside him, its tiny, charred skull tilted toward her as if it were watching. "We can't leave him," she whispered. "We have to," Victor snapped, shoving her forward. "If you want to survive the next 5 minutes, you move. Understand me?" The fire surged, twisting into grotesque shapes, faces, hands, and gaping mouths formed within the flames. Ethan swore under his breath as the smoke thickened, the heat pressing against his skin like unseen hands trying to push through. "Run!" Victor barked. They bolted. The streets of Ashmere warped as they ran, the once silent ruins now filled with the cacophony of cries, whispers, and echoes of the dead. The ash on the ground wasn't ash anymore. It was moving, writhing like a carpet of maggots. Every step sent it scattering, but it gathered again, following them, clawing at their ankles. Sarah tripped. Ethan spun around, grabbing her before the ash could swallow her whole. Beneath her, the ground pulsed. For just a moment, he saw something underneath the surface. Hands, reaching upward, fingers clawing through the dust. He pulled her to her feet, his face pale. "Don't look down," he said. Ahead, St. Ren's loomed closer, its broken doors hanging open like a mouth welcoming them in. The bell above the church swayed on its own, its low, hollow sound vibrating through the air. Mara stumbled up the cracked stone steps, panting. "Why is it ringing? Who's ringing it?" Victor didn't answer. He reached the church entrance first and froze. His scarred hand trembled as he pointed. "No, no, no, no." They followed his gaze. The inside of St. Ren's was wrong, impossible. The pews had been overturned, the wood blackened and warped, yet something grew there, thick, pulsating roots that twisted like veins, spreading across the floor and curling up the walls. From the center of the church, a massive hole yawned, the roots spiraling into the dark abyss below. And then there were the figures. Dozens of them, rows of townsfolk standing rigidly in the shadows, their bodies encased in cracked ash. Their heads twitched unnaturally, jerked toward the sound of the bell, their empty eye sockets glowing faintly red. Their mouths opened in unison, though no sound came out, just a low, guttural exhale that vibrated in the bones of anyone who heard it. Mara gasped. "They're waiting. For what?" Ethan demanded. Before anyone could answer, Sarah let out a sharp gasp. She was staring at the altar. There, standing beneath the fractured bell tower, was a priest. Or, at least, it used to be a priest. The figure wore a tattered cassock, its edges singed and smoking. The flesh on its face had been burned away, leaving only an empty, blackened skull grinning down at them. A single flame flickered in its eye sockets, dancing wildly. It raised one charred hand, beckoning. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice echoed, though the skull's mouth didn't move. Victor stepped back, his entire body trembling. "It's him. He was here the night of the fire. He started all of this." Mara turned toward Victor, her face pale. "How do you know that?" Victor didn't answer. The priest's head tilted sharply. "Your souls do not belong here, yet. But you will stay. All who enter must stay." The figures in the shadows began to move, their ashen bodies cracking, twitching, crawling forward with slow, jerking motions. "Back up," Ethan whispered. The priest raised both arms. The bell above began to ring again, and the ground shook. The roots coiled tighter around the church, spreading toward the door. "Run!" Victor shouted. They spun around, but the church doors were gone. In their place was only stone, slick with moisture and covered in dark symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them. "We are trapped," Mara breathed. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching the bundle she had carried so carefully. Tears streaked her pale cheeks as she whispered something unintelligible, over and over. Ethan grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "What are you saying? What are you doing?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide and hollow. "We can't leave unless someone stays. That's what it wants." The priest's voice thundered again, low and ancient. "One must burn. The others may go." The roots were curling closer, the ashen figures dragging themselves across the floor, their mouths stretching wider and wider. Victor's gaze darted from Sarah to Ethan to Mara. "It's lying. It doesn't let anyone leave." The priest tilted its skull, as if amused. The flames in its eyes flared brighter. "Choose, or burn together." The bell tolled again. Louder. Closer. Ethan turned toward the others, his heart pounding. Ashen smoke swirled around them, the fire's breath growing hotter. He could feel the unseen hands pressing against him, clawing at his chest, trying to rip something out. "Someone has to decide," Victor hissed. But the priest was already stepping closer, and the fire began to rise. The fire roared louder, its heat like a living force pressing against their skin, forcing sweat to bead and fear to rise. Around them, the figures of ash dragged themselves forward, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide as if screaming without sound. The blackened priest stood at the center, a flame dancing madly in the sockets of his skull. "One must burn," the priest repeated, his voice vibrating through the stone walls. "Choose, or all will burn." Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned the room. The roots, thick and pulsating, were closing in. The ashen figures crawled faster, fingers scraping against the cracked stone floor, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. "We are not doing this," Ethan growled, backing up. "We don't sacrifice people. This thing, whatever it is, it's playing with us." Victor turned to him, his scarred face slick with sweat. "It's not playing. It's a bargain. It always was. This place feeds on souls. And if we don't give it one, it'll take us all." Mara's voice trembled. "How do you know so much about this, Victor?" Victor hesitated, but before he could speak, the ground shook violently. The hole in the center of the church yawned wider, and a foul stench rose from below, a mix of burning meat and something older, rotten, like 1,000 graves unearthed at once. From the pit came a sound, a deep, guttural breathing. Ethan staggered back, choking on the smoke. "We are running out of time." The roots shot forward suddenly, snaking across the floor towards Sarah, who still knelt motionless beside the small, charred skeleton. The roots curled around her legs, pulling her toward the pit. Her face was calm, as though she had accepted what the rest of them hadn't. "No!" Ethan lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and pulling hard. "Get up! Come on!" Sarah turned her head toward him slowly, her hollow eyes unfocused. "It has to be me. I brought her back. I." Before she could finish, Victor's voice rang out, hoarse and desperate. "It doesn't matter who. Move!" Victor grabbed a pew, heaving the broken wood into the roots to slow them down. The firelight cast monstrous shadows of his actions onto the church walls, making him look less like a man and more like something twisted and inhuman. The priest's hollow voice grew louder, echoing as though coming from inside their skulls. "Choose, now." Ethan's mind raced. No way out. No time. They had to fight. He gritted his teeth and grabbed a broken piece of wood from the shattered pew. The end was jagged, sharp. "We are not sacrificing anyone. We'll figure this out." Victor turned on him, his face contorted in a mix of fear and rage. "You don't understand. You can't fight it." Mara stepped forward suddenly, clutching her notebook to her chest. "We need to understand why this is happening. There's always a reason." Her voice broke as she flipped the pages furiously, stopping on a passage that looked old, worn edges and ink smudged from countless readings. The fire didn't start by accident. It was a ritual. The priest made a pact. A pact with what? Ethan demanded. Mara's eyes darted to the pulsing roots, the gaping pit. Something ancient. Something that feeds on fear. Souls offered in terror burn brighter. "Then we give it nothing," Ethan shouted. "If it feeds on fear, we—" A terrible shriek cut him off. The roots had pierced Sarah's leg, dragging her forward. She screamed, clutching at the stone floor as her nails cracked and split. Ethan lunged, grabbing her arm, but the force pulling her was too strong. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice breaking. The priest stepped closer, his cassock rippling as though unseen hands moved beneath it. "One for salvation. One for escape." Victor's face twisted with desperation. He grabbed Ethan by the collar, yanking him away. "You're wasting time. Get off me." Ethan shoved him back, the jagged wood still in his grip. Victor stumbled, then froze, his eyes narrowing. Slowly, a cold realization dawned on his face. "You won't do it, will you?" Ethan stepped back, holding the wood tighter. "What are you talking about?" Victor's lips curled into something between a sneer and a grimace. "If you won't choose, then I'll do it for you." Before Ethan could react, Victor lunged for Sarah. Time seemed to slow. Sarah screamed as Victor grabbed her, dragging her toward the pit. Ethan's heart pounded as rage exploded inside him. He didn't think, he just acted. He swung the jagged wood with all his strength. The sharp end pierced Victor's side, sinking deep. Victor's eyes went wide, a shocked gasp escaping his lips. He staggered backward, hands clutching the wood as blood poured from the wound. "You fool!" Victor choked, collapsing to his knees. Ethan stood frozen, breathing hard, his hands slick with sweat and blood. Around them, the fire reacted, its flames twisting higher, almost gleeful. The roots recoiled slightly, and for a moment, the priest seemed pleased. Victor fell forward, his body convulsing as though something invisible was pulling him apart. The roots shot forward again, wrapping around his body and dragging him toward the pit. Ethan turned away, bile rising in his throat. Mara's scream echoed in his ears. "Ethan, look!" He forced himself to turn back. Victor's body hung suspended above the pit, the roots coiling tighter. His mouth opened in a silent, eternal scream as the fire consumed him, burning him from the inside out. His skin turned black, flaking away like ash on the wind. The priest's voice boomed through the church, triumphant. "The price is paid." The fire surged, rushing across the floor toward them. "Go!" Ethan shouted. He grabbed Mara and Sarah, dragging them toward the far wall. The stone beneath their feet was splitting, cracking apart. Smoke filled the air, making it impossible to see. Mara's voice broke through the chaos. "There! A door!" Ethan blinked through the smoke and spotted it. A small, wooden door in the far corner of the church, barely visible beneath the encroaching roots. It shouldn't have been there, but he didn't care. The three of them sprinted toward it, dodging the flames and roots that lashed out at them like whips. Ethan reached the door first, shoving it open. A wave of freezing air hit him, shocking his lungs. "Go!" he shouted, pulling Mara and Sarah through. The moment they stumbled out, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening boom. The three of them collapsed onto cold, damp ground, gasping for air. The smoke was gone. The fire was gone. Only silence remained. Ethan lifted his head, his vision swimming. They were no longer in the church. Around them stretched an endless field of graves, old, broken tombstones jutting from the earth like crooked teeth. Mara whispered, her voice trembling, "Where are we now?" Ethan didn't answer. Somewhere in the distance, a bell began to toll again. The bell's toll echoed across the endless graveyard, deep and resonant, shaking the ground beneath them. Ethan pushed himself up on trembling arms, his eyes darting across the desolate landscape. The tombstones stretched in all directions, some tilted and cracked, others freshly dug. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of decay and something older, like mildew, that had settled into the earth for centuries. Mara sat up beside him, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest, her lips trembling. This isn't real. It's another trap." Sarah was silent, her face pale as a ghost. She rocked back and forth, whispering to herself, her blooded hands still trembling. Ethan grabbed her shoulders. "Sarah, look at me. Where are we? What is this place?" Her unfocused gaze shifted to his face, and she whispered, "The place where they come to rest, the ones who burned." A shiver shot down Ethan's spine. Behind them, the door they'd come through was gone, only more graves, stretching into infinity. The bell tolled again, louder this time. Ethan staggered to his feet, pulling Mara with him. "We are not staying here. There's got to be a way out." Mara's voice was hoarse. "I don't think there is." Ethan turned to snap a reply, but his words died in his throat. Across the field of graves, figures began to rise. First one, then dozens. They emerged slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural. Ashen corpses crawled out of the earth, their blackened hands clawing at the dirt, their hollow sockets glowing faintly red, just like the figures in the church. But these were different. They spoke. Low, hollow voices whispered from every direction. "Come with us. Stay. Forever." Ethan's pulse hammered as he grabbed Mara's hand, pulling her forward. "We move. Don't stop. Don't look at them." Sarah followed, stumbling as she clutched aside, her breath ragged. The whispers grew louder as the dead rose faster, dragging themselves forward in broken, lurching motions. The bell tolled again. Suddenly, the ground split open with a thunderous crack. A fissure erupted just ahead, and from the gaping darkness below, a new voice rose, a voice that made Ethan's blood freeze in his veins. It was Victor. "Why are you running?" His voice called, twisted and echoing. "You killed me, Ethan. You chose me." Ethan stopped dead, his chest heaving. From the fissure, Victor's face emerged, blackened, burnt, his eyes hollow but glowing. His scorched lips twisted into a grotesque grin as he pulled himself from the earth. "You can't escape. None of us can. Run!" Ethan shouted, pulling Mara with him. Victor's charred figure rose fully now, towering, his arms elongated and unnaturally thin. The earth trembled as he stepped forward, his blackened feet leaving molten imprints behind. "You think you're different, Ethan?" Victor's voice boomed, his hollow eyes fixed on him. "You think this place will let you go?" Ethan's legs burned as they ran, weaving between crumbling tombstones, but the dead were everywhere, crawling, whispering, reaching. The air thickened, as if the graveyard itself was trying to drag them down into its depths. "There's nowhere to go." Mara sobbed, her voice breaking. "We are trapped." "No," Ethan growled, spotting something in the distance, a faint light. A cold, Bluish glow hovered far across the graveyard, just beyond a field of gnarled dead trees. It looked like an exit, or at least, a chance. There! Keep moving. The three of them tore through the graveyard, the ash and dirt shifting underfoot. The whispers followed, growing louder. Victor's voice thundered again from behind. You think you'll escape? This place owns you. The light grew closer, bright enough now to cast faint shadows. It was coming from a gate, an iron gate, ancient and covered in rust, but open just enough for them to squeeze through. Mara reached it first, shoving her notebook into the opening to pry it wider. Go, go! Ethan pushed Sarah through, then Mara, glancing over his shoulder as he followed. Victor was right there, his charred face contorted with rage as he reached for Ethan, his elongated fingers inches away. You belong here. Ethan threw himself through the gate, landing hard on the other side. Mara yanked the notebook free, and the iron gate slammed shut with an ear-splitting clang. Silence. The whispers stopped. The bell stopped. Ethan lay on the ground, chest heaving, staring at the now-sealed gate. Beyond it, Victor's figure faded into the darkness, the graveyard sinking into an unnatural stillness. Sarah's voice broke the silence. Is it over? Ethan sat up slowly, glancing around. They were no longer in the graveyard. The sky above them was a dull gray, and they sat on cracked asphalt, Ashmore's main street. The town looked the same as when they'd arrived, but there was no smoke, no fire, just silence. Mara looked at Ethan, her face pale and hollow. We are back. Sarah let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her cheeks. We are alive. But Ethan wasn't so sure. He glanced at his hands. His palms were still smeared with ash, the smell of smoke lingering in his nose. Then he noticed it. In the distance, St. Wren's Church still stood. Its bell tower loomed against the grey sky, the faintest hint of red light glowing through the cracks in its walls. Mara followed his gaze and froze. Ethan, the church. It's still. I know, he murmured. Sarah's whisper was barely audible. It's not over. Ethan stood, his muscles aching, his mind screaming at him to leave, to run and never look back. But something kept him rooted to the spot. The faint glow from St. Wren's pulsed, like the heartbeat of something waiting, something alive. Ethan? Mara asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer, because deep inside, Ethan knew. No one ever truly left Ashmore. The trapped souls would remain. And now, so would they. As the three of them walked down the cracked road in silence, the faint toll of a bell echoed once more from St. Wren's Church. And in the shadows, unseen hands began to reach out again.